Solomon Vance was 37 years old the night his wife looked him in the eye across their kitchen table and said, with the particular calm of someone who had rehearsed it, that he would never be enough. Not for her. Not for her family. Not for the life she had decided she deserved. He had been eating leftover rice and chicken he'd made himself. Sitting in the kitchen of the house he had poured 5 years of Saturdays into renovating, wearing a t-shirt with a paint stain on the sleeve, and she had stood in the doorway with her arms folded and delivered it like a verdict. Her mother had been saying the same thing for years, apparently, her friends agreed. And she, Camille, had finally decided to stop pretending otherwise. She had the divorce papers drawn up already. He signed them 12 days later without a single modification. What Camille did not know, sitting in her mother's house that first night of freedom, was what Solomon had spent the previous 4 years building, not with her, not for her, but in the patient, methodical way of a man who understood that the most important work was almost always invisible until it was done. What she did not know was what was behind the gate at the end of the new address she had been given only once, in passing, by someone they both used to know. What she did not know was what it would cost her to knock on it. 18 months after the night she said he would never be enough, she knocked on that gate anyway. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The mornings had always been Solomon's best hours. That had not changed. He was up before 6, coffee already made, standing at the window of the kitchen in the rental he'd moved into after the house sold, a modest 2-bedroom off a side street in Nashville's Bordeaux neighborhood, where he had grown up and where the houses were close together and the yards were small and everybody knew what everybody drove. He had taken almost nothing from the marriage. A box of tools. His grandmother's iron skillet. The books. He had left the furniture, the artwork, the good dishes, the bed they had shared for 7 years. He had not wanted any of it. He had wanted the sensation of having set something down that had been getting heavier without his noticing. He worked logistics. Had for 12 years, since the army, since the 2 deployments that had taught him something no classroom ever had about the relationship between patients and outcome. He was a supply chain manager for a mid-sized medical distribution company. Unremarkable on paper, the kind of career people nodded at politely at parties before moving on to talk to someone more interesting. He drove a 6-year-old Silverado with 80,000 miles on it. He wore the same 4 or 5 shirts in rotation. He ate lunch at his desk most days and went to bed early. Camille had met him at a mutual friend's birthday gathering 7 years ago, when she was still in graduate school for communications and still believed that ambition alone was a form of capital. She had liked, at first, that he was steady. She had liked that he listened. She had liked that he didn't perform, that what you saw was what you got. At some point in the last 3 years of their marriage, those same qualities had become the charges against him. He was too quiet, too simple, too content with not enough. He had a memory of the first good year, which he kept the way you keep a photograph, not to live in it, but to confirm it had been real. A road trip to New Orleans. A January Sunday they spent cooking all afternoon and watching it snow. The way she laughed at something he said in a parking lot once, so hard she had to hold onto his arm to stay upright. That had been real. It had also been a long time ago. His grandfather, Curtis Vance, who had run a small upholstery shop in Bordeaux for 31 years before his hands gave out, used to say, "Boy, the difference between a man who has something and a man who looks like he has something is about 10 years of quiet work." Solomon had been in the quiet work years for a long time. He had not expected anyone to see it yet. The sign of trouble had not arrived the way he expected trouble to arrive. It did not announce itself. It was a Wednesday evening, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. A Nashville area code. A woman's voice he placed after a moment as belonging to Terry Lawson, who had been Camille's closest friend for the better part of a decade, and who Solomon had always quietly understood, saw more than she said. "I need you to know something," Terry said, "because I think you deserve to." He pulled into a gas station and sat in the Silverado and listened. What Terry told him took 11 minutes. He did not interrupt once. He thanked her, put the truck in drive, and went home to his kitchen and sat with the iron skillet on the stove and the coffee gone cold beside him, and thought for a long time about what he was going to do with what he now knew. He was very calm. He had always been very calm. The Army had pressed that quality into him so deep it was structural now. He opened his laptop and began. Terry had not told him everything because she did not know everything, but she had told him enough to know which direction to look. What Terry told him was this: Camille had been involved with a man named Brent Holloway for slightly more than 2 years. Brent Holloway was an event promoter with a curated social media presence, a leased BMW, and a reputation in certain Nashville circles as someone who was very good at appearing to be on the verge of something large. He had been on the verge of something large, by Terry's account, for approximately 6 years. The reality, which Terry had assembled from mutual contacts and one uncomfortable dinner party, was that Brent Holloway had $11,000 in credit card debt, a sublet he was 2 months behind on, and a pattern of attaching himself to women who had more financial stability than he let on he noticed. Solomon sat with that for a moment. Then he opened the county property records for Davidson County, a database he knew how to use from years of logistics work that had occasionally required him to verify vendor addresses and asset claims. In logistics, you learned early that the most important information was almost never in the documents someone handed you voluntarily. It was in the records no one remembered you could pull. What he found in the next 40 minutes was not what Terry had told him. It was larger. Camille had co-signed a lease on a commercial event space in East Nashville 3 months before the divorce was final. Her name was on the agreement. Brent Holloway's name was also on the agreement. The lease was for 36 months at $4,200 a month. The deposit had been $12,600. He cross-referenced the dates. The lease had been signed on a Thursday in August. He had a specific memory of that Thursday in August because Camille had told him she was attending a work retreat in Murfreesboro. He had cooked dinner alone that night, leftover rice, the same iron skillet, and assumed nothing. He had eaten in the quiet house and gone to bed at 10 and set his alarm for 5:30. He had been 3 miles away from where she was signing her name to a 36-month commitment with another man. He photographed the record on his screen. He cross-referenced the joint credit card statement, the one they had maintained for household purchases, which he had kept access to for 90 days post-divorce per the settlement terms, which were expiring in 6 weeks. He had not looked at it closely before this moment because he had not known what he was looking for. He looked now. 4 charges stood out between July and September of the previous year: a design firm in the Gulch, $840, a catering consultation in East Nashville, $1,100, an audio equipment rental, $620, an LLC filing fee, $200. She had been building something with Brent Holloway while she was still married to Solomon. She had been funding it, at least in part, with money from accounts they both contributed to. The charges had been spread out, each one small enough to disappear into a month of ordinary spending, each one landing on a different week, so no single statement looked unusual. It was a pattern. Supply chain had taught him to see patterns. When a vendor was skimming, they never took the same amount twice. They varied it, staggered it, buried it in the noise. It looked like noise until you charted it over time, and then it had a shape. And the shape was always a choice someone made deliberately. He pulled up his own financial records. He ran the numbers the way he ran supply chain audits, methodically, without emotion, looking for variance across the full timeline of their marriage, not just the final year. His hands did not shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He found $6,400 in charges he could not account for across 9 months. Not large amounts individually. The largest single transaction was $980, but together, mapped against a timeline he built in a spreadsheet at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night in his quiet rental kitchen. They told a story that was not about impulse. It was about planning. She had been funding something else's foundation, while he had believed they were still building the same one. He sat with that for a while. He was not devastated. He had thought he might be, and he was not. He was the way he got when he found a structural problem on a job site. Still, focused, already moving toward the solution before the emotion had a chance to arrive. He opened a new folder on his laptop. He titled it simply, Documentation. Then he called an attorney named Marcus Webb, who had been recommended by his supervisor at work and who had, by reputation, a particular gift for cases that involved financial entanglement and post-marital asset recovery. Tomorrow morning, Marcus Webb said, when he heard the shape of it. 8 o'clock. Solomon closed the laptop. He stood at the kitchen window for a while. Outside, the streetlight made orange circles on the wet pavement, and a neighbor's dog moved through the edge of the light and disappeared. He had 4 years of work no one had seen yet. He had time. He went to bed. Marcus Webb's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like good coffee and old case files. Webb himself was 53, broad-shouldered, with the manner of someone who had been in enough rooms with enough liars to have developed a reliable internal instrument for the truth. He read through Solomon's documentation folder, printed and organized the night before into a tabbed binder, because that was how Solomon approached any problem worth solving, and he did not flinch. He turned each page with the careful attention of a man reading a blueprint, noting things, making small marks in the margin. She co-signed a commercial lease during the marriage, Webb said. Even if she claims it was post-separation, the asset liability attaches to the marital period if the funding's sourced from joint accounts. He looked up. Which you have documentation for? Yes, Solomon said. The $6,400 in unaccounted charges, that's recoverable, plus interest, potentially plus legal fees depending on the judge. Webb set down the binder and laced his fingers together. The 90-day access window on the joint card, you're inside it still? 3 weeks left. Good. I want Denise Morris to run the full forensic pass before it closes. She's fast, and she's thorough. He tapped the binder. What I want to know is the full picture, not just the marriage. You said on the phone you had something else. Solomon nodded. I need you to understand the full context before we proceed. He told Webb about the work he had been doing for 4 years. Not the logistics job, the other work. The work he did before 6 a.m. and on weekends, and in the quiet hours that Camille had interpreted as evidence of his limitations, his smallness, his inability to want the things worth wanting. He had been acquiring property. It had started modestly, the way all his projects started. A duplex in Bordeaux he had bought for $67,000 6 years ago, before the market moved, when the neighborhood was still the neighborhood he had grown up in, and no one from outside it was paying attention yet. He had renovated both units himself, on weekends, using skills his grandfather had passed down across 30 years of showing rather than telling. He had a general contractor's license he had obtained at 28 because he liked to know how things worked, and because a license meant you could act on what you knew. He rented both units and used the income to fund the next acquisition. Then another property. Then a third. Then two more in the same year the marriage had started showing its fractures, which Solomon now recognized as the year he had worked hardest, as if the work had been the ballast. All of it held in an LLC his grandfather had helped him name, CV Holdings, for Curtis Vance, which he had structured carefully, with the help of a financial advisor named Brenda Okafor, who had been managing his books since the beginning, and who was the only person outside his grandfather who had known the full scope of it. Brenda had a habit of sending him a single text on the first of every month that said only, "Growing." He had saved every one of them. The divorce had been clean in the legal sense, because Camille had never known what to ask for. She had not known the LLC existed. She had not known the portfolio existed. She had not asked, because she had not believed there was anything to find. She had looked at the Silverado and the paint-stained T-shirt and the leftover rice and concluded her assessment was complete. She had looked at a man eating dinner in his own kitchen and seen the ceiling, not the foundation. The portfolio, by the time Solomon sat across from Marcus Webb, consisted of 9 properties, 7 of them in Nashville, 2 in Clarksville. Combined current market value, $2.3 million. Monthly rental income after expenses, $14,200. Webb looked at him for a long moment, the kind of moment that had its own weight. She signed a settlement that made no claim on any of this, Webb said. She didn't know it existed, Solomon said. And the LLC was established before the marriage? 18 months before. Webb exhaled slowly, not with surprise, with the specific satisfaction of a man who had spent a career finding the place where the facts lined up cleanly. She has no claim, he said. None. The premarital establishment of the LLC, the clean documentation trail, the separation of the joint and private finances, this is about as clean as I've seen. He paused. What she does have is a $29,000 liability on a commercial lease co. signed with a man who is not going to help her pay it. That's what I understand, Solomon said. Then here is what we're going to do, Webb said, and opened a clean yellow legal pad. He drove from Webb's office to Brenda Okafor's, where he spent 2 hours reviewing the full financial picture and authorizing the next phase of what Brenda had been quietly referring to for 4 years as the expansion. She had the numbers ready before he sat down, which was her habit. Brenda operated in prepared facts and did not waste time on anything else. She was 60 years old and had been doing this for 30 of them, and she had a way of presenting a portfolio summary that made it feel like reading the last page of a very satisfying book. The commercial acquisition in Germantown had been on her radar for 2 years, a small mixed-use building, 3 retail units below and 4 residential above, on a block that was already changing around it. They had been waiting for the moment, and the moment had arrived. The asking price was $1.1 million. Solomon's reserve capital and current financing position made it workable. They signed the paperwork that afternoon. The building would close in 30 days. This is the one your grandfather would have loved, Brenda said when they were done. I know, Solomon said. I thought about him when I first walked through it. She looked at him for a moment over her reading glasses. You doing okay with the rest of it? Yes, he said. It was true. She nodded once, in the way of someone who believed him. Okay then. Let's close this thing. He went home that evening and called his grandfather Curtis, who answered on the second ring the way he always did, without ceremony, as if he had simply been waiting for the phone to ring and was not surprised when it did. Solomon told him about Webb, about the documentation, about the Germantown building. Curtis listened without speaking, the way he had listened to everything Solomon had brought him over 40 years, a son's questions, a young man's plans, a husband's quiet confusions. And now this. When Solomon was done, Curtis was quiet for a moment. The line had the particular quality of an old man thinking in an old house, a television low somewhere in the background. "Son," Curtis said, "you put in the work. The work doesn't lie. That was all. It was enough." Solomon did not see Camille again for 6 months. In that time, he moved out of the rental in Bordeaux and into a house he had saved for the occasion, a renovated Craftsman on a quiet lot in East Nashville, behind an iron fence with a motorized gate. He had owned it for 2 years and kept it vacant, knowing it was the one he would eventually live in. He poured the last of the renovation work into it in January and February, doing much of the finish work himself: tile, trim, a back porch that ran the length of the house, and moved in on a Saturday in March. He planted a kitchen garden along the south fence. He set up his grandfather's workbench in the basement. He had Brenda over for dinner one weekend, and Marcus Webb and his wife the weekend after that. He was not lonely. He had not been lonely since the night Camille left, which was something he had not expected and had come to understand. The Germantown building closed on schedule. He hired a property manager for the residential units, 2 of the retail spaces leased within 60 days. He heard about Brent Holloway's situation from Terry, who still called occasionally, not to report but simply out of what Solomon had come to recognize as decency. The event space had folded after 8 months, undercapitalized, over-leveraged, dependent on a promotional network that turned out to be thinner than it appeared. Brent had defaulted on his portion of the lease. Camille had been left holding her half of the liability, $29,400 in remaining balance, plus the deposit she would not recover. She had moved in with her mother after the sublet she and Brent had shared was returned to the landlord. Solomon heard all of this and thought about it for approximately the length of a cup of coffee, and then went back to his work. It was a Friday evening in early October, 18 months after the night she said he would never be enough, when the notification came from the gate camera. He was in the kitchen making dinner, the iron skillet on the stove, the last of the garden's tomatoes in a colander in the sink. The camera on the gate was one of 4 he had installed around the property, not out of paranoia, but out of habit, a logistics man's habit of tracking what came and went. His phone showed him the image before he heard anything: Camille, standing outside the iron gate, in the kind of coat she used to wear when she wanted to look put together, hair done, composure assembled with visible care. She had found the address from somewhere. He was not surprised. Nashville was not a large city among people who had shared a life. She did not ring the intercom. She knocked on the gate itself, 3 times, with her knuckles. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the phone in his hand, the skillet beginning to smoke lightly. He turned the burner down. He looked through the kitchen window at the garden, at the late tomatoes still heavy on the vine in the October afternoon light. He thought about what his grandfather had said. He thought about Brenda's text on the 1st of every month. He thought about the Thursday night he had eaten rice alone in a house he did not yet know was already half vacated by someone who had not told him she was leaving. He was not angry. He registered that clearly. He was not cold either. He was simply a man standing on ground he had built himself, looking out at something that used to have a claim on him and no longer did. He turned off the burner. He walked to the front of the house and opened the door and stood on the porch, visible through the bars of the gate, in the amber light of the late afternoon. He did not open it. She looked up and saw him. Something moved across her face, relief first, then something more complicated. She said his name. "Camille," he said. She had prepared something. He could see the preparation in the way she stood, the controlled breath, the organized sentences behind her eyes. She began to say it. Something about perspective, about what she had not understood, about having seen things clearly now that some time had passed. She said she had been wrong about what mattered. She said she had been wrong about him. She said a version of the word enough 3 times in the space of a minute, and each time it landed differently than the last time she had said it. In that kitchen, 11 months into a plan he had not known she was running. He listened. He did not interrupt. He let her say the whole of what she had prepared. Because a man who had waited 4 quiet years to be understood could afford a few more minutes. When she was finished, the street was quiet. A car passed at the end of the block. The gate's shadow fell across the sidewalk in a long, straight line. "I hope you're doing all right," he said. It was true. He did not wish her harm. He never had. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it, and Solomon Vance had better things to spend his attention on. "Solomon, She stopped. She had seen something in his expression that was not anger, not cold, not cruelty. It was not performance of strength, and it was not indifference. It was simply the steady, legible face of a man who had finished building the thing he was building and did not need anything from her to proceed. There was nothing to argue with. That was the thing. She had come ready to argue or negotiate or move him in some direction, and there was no door in that face to push against. He was not behind a wall. He was simply elsewhere. Already elsewhere. Had been for a while. "Take care of yourself," he said. He went back inside. He closed the door. He heard the gate camera ping again 60 seconds later. The street, the lamplight, empty, the coat moving away at the far edge of the frame, and then gone. He went back to the kitchen. The iron skillet was on the stove. The tomatoes from the garden were in a bowl on the counter, heavy and split at their own seams. He made dinner slowly, the way he liked to cook, without hurrying, the way his grandfather had taught him. The gate stayed closed. It was the right gate. It was his gate. He had built it, same as everything else, on ground that was entirely his own. 19 months later, a woman named Jade, who taught architecture at Vanderbilt, and who had a particular habit of asking questions about structural decisions with the kind of specific curiosity that told you she actually wanted the answer, was in that kitchen with him on a Sunday morning, reading at the table while he cooked. She had found the property records once, not snooping, but because she was the kind of person who looked things up, and she had said only, "You did all this quietly." He had said yes. She had gone back to her book. That had been enough. He was solvent. He was rooted. He was at peace. Some things, he had learned, did not require an audience to be real. The work was always the proof. The quiet years always told the truth eventually. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.